The parking garage camera catches her pulling in at 9:44 p.m. She's been in that space for 2 seconds, not 2 minutes, not 2 hours, 2 seconds, when the back door of a Jeep Cherokee swings open. What no one in that Uptown Dallas neighborhood could explain was this: the shooter already knew exactly where she parked. That's not a robbery. Robberies are opportunistic. This was a calendar event. Dr. Kendra Hatcher was killed the night before her flight to Cancun. Not after. Not a week later. The night before. And the woman who orchestrated it knew the travel itinerary because she'd been reading her ex-boyfriend's private messages for months. This is a story about what envy looks like when it gets organized. When it hires people. When it sets a deadline. And it almost worked, because the woman at the center of it understood something every good investigator dreads: that being innocent of pulling the trigger is not the same as being innocent. Kendra Hatcher grew up in central Illinois, the kind of place where, as her sister Ashley would later tell a Dallas courtroom, evil like this simply wasn't in the vocabulary. She captained her high school cheerleading squad. She became a dentist. She moved to the Dallas area to work at a pediatric practice in Irving, and she took yoga classes on weekday mornings. And she smiled at people in a way her instructor later described as outspoken, which is a strange word for a smile until you understand that Kendra's warmth had an argument in it. It insisted you feel it. She was also in love. Dr. Ricardo Paniagua, Ricky, had been seeing her for months. They were planning a trip to Cancun. The kind of trip that means something. Dallas in 2015 was a city in the middle of a decade-long expansion. Uptown, where Kendra lived at the Gables Park 17 apartments, was new money made visible: valet restaurants, polished concrete, residents who left their cars in monitored garages because monitored garages meant safety. Dallas homicide detective Eric Barnes would later say the location surprised him. Uptown didn't have shootings in parking garages. That was the whole point of Uptown. Here's the flaw in this case that nearly buried it. Brenda Delgado had a receipt. Not a vague memory of being somewhere else. A time-stamped Chili's receipt she pulled from the top of her wallet the moment Detective Barnes asked for it. She studied at a library from noon to 6, then had dinner with a friend until 8:57 p.m. The surveillance footage confirmed she couldn't have been behind the wheel of the Jeep Cherokee. Barnes took the receipt and she said, "Go ahead, keep it." That receipt is the case's first disruption, because innocent people don't walk into murder interrogations with their alibis already printed and filed. Skip Hollandsworth, a journalist who covered the case extensively for Texas Monthly, later noted that Brenda's composure in that room was the opposite of what investigators expect. She wasn't nervous. She was helpful. She had a name ready: her friend Crystal. That name was the second disruption. Brenda Delgado handed over her own alibi witness and her own getaway driver in the same breath, and called it cooperation. What investigators hadn't yet understood was that both moves were the same move. The organized envy had anticipated this route. Brenda Delgado was the daughter of a Mexican factory worker who came to Dallas for opportunity. She put herself through dental hygienist school. She went to an evangelical church. She didn't drink much. She was, by every external measurement, someone who had constructed her life carefully from modest materials.
Said that Brenda had Ricky's iPhone account loaded
they
to
dated
another
for 2
iPhone,
years.
and she's able to
they
track
lived
him that
together.
way. So
when he ended it and began seeing Kendra, something in that careful construction began to give way.
They also
what Ricky didn't know,
that after that
what
weekend,
no one around
Ricky
Brenda
and
knew
Kendra
until
would be moving to
investigators
San
pulled her
Francisco.
phone, was the scale of what came next. She had accessed his iCloud account. She was reading his text messages, monitoring his calls, tracking his calendar. She knew about Cancun. She knew the departure date. When Ricky kept running into her at his salsa class and on his running path, he assumed coincidence. He would later testify in a Dallas courtroom that he'd had no idea. Friends told Hollandsworth that Brenda had stopped being able to talk about anything else.
Drive her.
All Brenda could
Menendez
talk about,
also testified
one friend
that
said,
in June
was Ricky
of
and
2015,
Kendra, and
Brenda
how she wanted
asked if
someone
he
to
could get
hurt
her a
one of them
gun.
or both.
He said he would
She had
not
approached
because
her
he
cousin
didn't like
Moses
guns him not to
Martinez
say
with a
anything
baseball
to
bat and a
anyone
specific
because
instruction.
he could get in
She had
trouble
told
with
her
the
roommate
police
Jennifer
and
Escobar
risk
she
his
wanted Ricky
citizenship.
put in a coma
So
and
there's
Kendra
kind of a
injected
threat.
at the back of the neck.
Seems to be.
These weren't
Crystal
fantasies
said
she
she
kept
didn't
private.
see Love kill Kendra,
She was recruiting.
but she heard the
What she
shots
needed
fired.
was someone willing to
The
finish
medical
the job.
examiner later
Crystal
testified
Cortez
that
was
Kendra died
20-something,
as a result
broke,
of a gunshot
and
wound
raising a
to the
child.
back of the head.
Brenda
Crystal
offered
backed out of her
$500
parking
and
space,
drugs.
and
A
Love
dealer
ran
named
into the
Christopher
Jeep
Love,
with Kendra's
known to Dallas
belongings,
police as
her
a small-time
purse and a
marijuana
Nikon
distributor,
camera,
was
and a
offered what
gun.
investigators
Love got
later
in the
learned
rear
was a
passenger.
promised lifetime supply of cocaine, the dream, Love apparently believed, of becoming the next major drug player in Dallas. For $500 and a narcotics fantasy, Kendra Hatcher was going to die. Crystal Cortez gave Detective Barnes 4 different versions of what happened in that parking garage. The last one landed. In it, Brenda hadn't asked her to commit a murder. Brenda had asked her to steal a purse. The shooting, Crystal said, was just how it ended. The problem: Barnes had the surveillance footage, and Crystal never tried to leave. Detective Eric Barnes had been in homicide long enough to know when a room was performing rather than confessing. Crystal Cortez's stories changed shape every time he applied pressure. The masked gunman who climbed into her car. The robbery that wasn't supposed to go this far. Barnes had seen the footage. Crystal made no move to flee after the shot. She sat in that Jeep and waited. The organized envy framework. The idea that what happened to Kendra was not passion but planning, not rage but logistics, became clearer with each story Crystal revised. Robberies don't have pre-selected parking spots. Robberies don't happen the night before a scheduled flight that only an iCloud stalker would know about. Barnes built his geography carefully. The Gables Park 17 sits on Cedar Springs Road in Uptown, roughly a mile and a half from the Dallas Police Headquarters, where Crystal and Brenda were being interviewed simultaneously, in separate rooms, down the hall from each other. The Jeep Cherokee that carried Christopher Love to the parking garage was registered to the auto mechanic Brenda had been borrowing from, a connection that surfaced through the homicide tip line within hours of the public appeal. Everything was closed. Everyone was connected. The distance between Brenda's alibi and the crime scene was a 15-minute drive that she had arranged not to take. Barnes needed more to charge Brenda. Prosecutors told him the interrogation, impressive as it was, wasn't enough. He went back into the room. He told her she wasn't good enough for Ricky. He said it plainly. Maybe Ricky wanted a dentist instead of a dental hygienist. Maybe she just wasn't what he was looking for anymore. It was a deliberate provocation, and Brenda's response to it was, nothing. She sat in the air-conditioned room wrapped in blankets, and she said she had no motive. She said she hadn't even known who Kendra was. Barnes knew he had the right person. He also knew he didn't have enough. Within 48 hours of her interrogation, Brenda Delgado was in Mexico. The FBI's 10 most wanted list has had very few women on it in its entire history. Brenda Delgado made it within months of crossing the border, with a $100,000 reward attached to her name. The organized envy had run out of geography. Barnes turned his focus to Christopher Love. The phone records connected him, a number appearing in both Brenda's and Crystal's call history. Crystal confirmed it in the interrogation room. That's the shooter's number, she said. Love sat across from Barnes for somewhere between 21 and 22 hours total. He denied the parking garage. Denied the gun. Denied knowing Brenda Delgado or Crystal Cortez at any meaningful level. His car had been towed to the auto pound, and when investigators searched it, they missed the weapon on the first pass. Then an ATF explosive detection dog named Titan, present for demonstration, walked straight to the passenger side and sat down. The gun was under the center console. When Barnes showed Love the weapon, the denials became something else. Love confirmed the gun was his. The countdown on the case was now running differently. Barnes had a shooter, a driver, a phone record chain, a surveillance video, and a murder weapon. What he didn't have was Brenda Delgado, and without her, the person who had designed the entire operation would face no consequence at all. Note what was not being said publicly. The Dallas County District Attorney's Office has not explained, on the record, precisely why Brenda was released on outstanding traffic violations rather than held on stronger grounds while the murder case was being built. That gap, between what Barnes knew and what the system was willing to act on, is worth sitting with. For 6 months, Brenda lived in a small town in Mexico. The reward drew credible tips within hours of the public announcement. She was tracked, identified, and extradited to the United States to stand trial. Barnes was at the airport when she arrived. He said his eyes told her, "I told you I was going to get you." Love went to trial first. He rejected a deal that would have required him to testify against Brenda. He was, investigators noted, not interested in cooperating with anyone. Crystal Cortez had accepted a plea for 35 years and agreed to testify. She was the prosecution's spine. Her cross-examination in Love's trial was withering. Defense attorney George Milner hammered her credibility, her history of changing stories, and her admitted role in the murder. The more he pushed, juror Casey Miller would later recall, the more believable she became. She was a young single mother who had been handed money in the shape of a heart. She was not the architect of anything. The jury took 3 hours. Love was found guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to death. At sentencing, Christopher Love turned to the detectives and said, "You'll need to go get Brenda. She's the top of the puzzle." He wasn't wrong. And he had just guaranteed he'd spend the rest of his life in a Texas prison while the person who hired him stood trial in the next courtroom. Brenda Delgado's trial was, as Hollinsworth put it, the main course.
Menendez also
She sat at the
testified
defense
that in
table wearing
June
thick
of
glasses,
2015,
her hair
Brenda
pulled
asked
back.
if he could get her a gun.
Juror Casey Miller
He said he
watched
would
her
not
throughout
because
the
he didn't like
prosecution's
guns
opening.
and not to say
She had a
anything to
stone-cold
anyone
face,
because he
said.
could get in
She
trouble
just
with the
sat and
police
stared.
and risk his
Dallas County
citizenship.
Assistant District
So
Attorney
there's
Kevin
kind of a
Brooks
threat.
told the jury the
Seems
case
to
would
be.
revolve around one
Crystal
person's
said she
planning,
didn't see
one
Love
person's
kill
desire.
Kendra,
The
but she heard
defense,
the
led
shots
by
fired.
George Milner,
The
told them
medical
Crystal
examiner
Cortez was
later
a pathological
testified
liar
that
who
Kendra
had
died
orchestrated
as
the
a
robbery with
result of
Christopher
a
Love
gunshot
and allowed
wound
Brenda
to
to
the back
become
of
the
the head.
obvious suspect.
Crystal backed
Because
out of her
Brenda had
parking
told half of
space,
Dallas she
and
wanted
Love
Ricky's
ran into
girlfriend
the
gone.
Jeep with Kendra's
That argument
belongings,
required the jury
her
to
purse
believe
and a
that Crystal,
Nikon
a
camera,
woman with no
and a
documented
gun.
relationship
Love
to
got in the
Kendra
rear
Hatcher
pass-
and no access to Ricky's travel calendar, had decided on her own to commit murder in a parking garage belonging to a woman her accomplice's ex-girlfriend despised, on the specific night before that woman's vacation, and that this was a coincidence rather than coordination. Ricky testified. He had been staring forward and refusing to look toward the defense table. The prosecutor asked him to identify Brenda in court. For a few seconds, they locked eyes. Moses Martinez testified about the baseball bat. Jennifer Escobar testified about the coma and the injection. Both named Brenda directly. The prosecution put the compromising photos of Brenda's activities into evidence, not for shock but for motive. Corey Allen Redwine. No, that is the wrong case. Here, the prosecution's secondary witnesses established that Brenda had been constructing a target for months. Crystal took the stand again. Under cross-examination, she said, yes, she had told half-truths in her early interviews. Yes, she had lied. And then she said, Kendra Hatcher is dead because Brenda Delgado was envious of her. She said it in plain language, under oath, having already pled guilty to capital murder and accepted 35 years. She had no incentive left to protect anyone. The capability translation here is precise. A woman who had monitored a man's private communications for months without detection, recruited 3 separate individuals for escalating acts of violence, constructed a timed alibi, and fled a country within 48 hours of being questioned. This is not a person driven by uncontrolled emotion. This is a person who understood planning and used it. The defense rested without calling Brenda to testify. She had spent 6 months in Mexico on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. Her theory, that she was an innocent woman framed by Crystal Cortez, would have required her to explain every one of those months under oath. The jury deliberated for 20 minutes. The first vote, taken by written ballot, was 12-0. System failure passage. Brenda Delgado was questioned as a person of interest in a capital murder, released on outstanding traffic violations due to jail overcrowding, and was out of the country within 48 hours. No existing legal mechanism in Texas at that time required law enforcement to hold a person of interest in an active capital murder investigation beyond the duration of unrelated misdemeanor charges. The Dallas County DA's office has not publicly addressed the specific decision that resulted in her release during those 48 hours. The question is not whether Barnes acted wrongly. The record shows he acted aggressively and accurately. The question is whether the procedural gap between person of interest and formal suspect is wide enough to let a murder architect board a flight. Brenda's eventual extradition was only possible because Mexico's treaty prohibits returning defendants to face the death penalty, meaning the procedural gap that let her leave also saved her life. Because Brenda had been extradited from Mexico, Texas could not seek the death penalty. The jury's verdict stood, guilty of capital murder on a 12-0 first ballot. The sentence was mandatory, life in prison without the possibility of release. Detective Barnes had told her in that interrogation room that the truth was one step closer. He was right, in the way that matters. Not the step he intended, but the step justice eventually required. Kendra's sister, Ashley, stood before the court. Kendra's mother stood before the court. Ashley said she took comfort in knowing their God had given Kendra the ultimate spot in heaven. A spot, she said directly to Brenda, that you will never see. Their mother spoke about a 5-year-old who was Kendra's goddaughter, and a 3rd child on the way who would never meet her. She said, no matter how envious you were of any human being, that does not give you the right to destroy lives. She asked Brenda, who the hell do you think you are? Brenda Delgado did not speak. Christopher Love sits on death row in Texas, having rejected the deal that might have reduced his sentence in exchange for testimony he never gave. Crystal Cortez is serving 35 years under her plea agreement. She remains the only reason the full architecture of what happened became provable in court. A woman who admitted in open testimony to accepting $500 to drive a shooter to a parking garage, that admission, and everything attached to it, is what closed this case. Kendra Hatcher was 28 years old. She was going to Cancún the next morning. The organized envy at the center of this case required months of surveillance, 3 recruited participants, a constructed alibi, and a 6-month international flight. All of it to prevent a dentist from taking a vacation. What the prosecution called it, what the defense called it, what the jury called it, none of those words approach what Kendra's family called it. They called it a loss. And they were precise about what kind. The permanent, non-negotiable kind. The kind where a 5-year-old grows up without a godmother because someone with a phone and an iCloud password decided her death with schedule.
So,
Kendra Hatcher deserved better than to become a case study. She also deserved better than a procedural gap that allowed the person who planned her death to walk out of a Dallas police station and board a flight to Mexico while investigators were still building the evidence. She got justice. It took international extradition, a federal most wanted designation, and a cooperating witness who accepted 35 years to get there. That is not a clean outcome. That is an outcome assembled from the pieces that happened to survive. Before you go, if this kind of institutional gap concerns you, there is a specific development worth watching. Brenda Delgado's attorneys filed post-conviction appeals raising questions about the terms of her extradition agreement and whether the lifetime sentence satisfies Mexico's
Brenda
treaty
asked
requirements.
if he could get her a gun.
Those proceedings
he said he
are
would not
ongoing.
because he didn't like
if there is a
guns
ruling,
and didn't want to
this
have
channel
anything
will
to do
cover it
with
the
them
week it
because
happens.
he could get in
Subscribe
trouble with
so
the
you'll hear
police
when that
and
comes.
risk his citizenship.
And here's the question I want
so
you to
there's
answer in
kind
the
of
comments.
a threat.
Not
Seems to
generally,
be.
Yeah.
but specifically.
Jose also
Should a
testified
confirmed
that
person
Brenda
of
told
interest
him.
in an active
But she
capital
heard
murder
the shots
investigation be
fired.
releasable on
The
unrelated
medical
misdemeanor
examiner
charges
later
before a hold
testified
can
that
be
Kendra
formally
died
filed?
as a result
Yes or
of a
no?
gunshot wound
Because
to the
that
back
gap
of the
exists
head.
in Texas
Crystal
law right
backed out
now,
of her parking
and Brenda
space
Delgado is
and
the
Love
proof of
ran
what
into
fits
the
through
Jeep
it.
with Kendra's belongings, her purse and a Nikon camera, and a gun. Love got in the rear passenger side door and crouched down